What if I told you that one of the wildest, most terrifying legends in the entire history of hip-hop didn't reach his peak on a stage? What if I told you his most iconic moment didn't happen behind a microphone in a luxury studio, but on a cold, stainless steel slab inside a county morgue? Picture the scene. It is 4:35 inches the morning. The air is thick with the sterile chemical stench of formaldehyde and the crushing silence of the dead. In one of the metal drawers, tucked away like a forgotten file, lies a man. He is small in stature, barely 3 feet 8 inches tall, but the hole in his head tells a story of a life lived at 1,000 miles per hour. A bullet has traveled through his right eye, tearing through bone and tissue, exiting near his ear. The medics at the scene had checked for a pulse. They found nothing. The doctors at the hospital had checked for brain activity. They found a flat line. They did what they always do when the light goes out. They cleaned him up. They filled out the paperwork. They tied a yellow plastic tag to his big toe. Shaw, Richard, time of death, 4:35 a.m. Then they slid him into the dark, zipped up the heavy black vinyl bag, and left him to the silence. But Bushwick Bill was never good at following instructions. He was never good at staying in the boxes people tried to put him in. 2 hours and 45 minutes later, the impossible happened. Inside that pitch-black bag, a lung expanded. A heart, stagnant and cold, gave a sudden, violent twitch. Richard Shaw didn't just wake up. He detonated back into consciousness. Imagine the sheer, primal terror of the morgue attendants as they heard a frantic scratching coming from inside the metal locker. Imagine their faces when they pulled that drawer open, unzipped the bag, and saw a man with one eye missing, covered in dried blood and morgue fluids, sitting bolt upright. He didn't scream for help. He didn't cry. He looked at the terrified staff, his one remaining eye burning with a manic, otherworldly fire, and he demanded to know where his jewelry was. He wanted his rings. He wanted his chain. And then, as if he hadn't just spent 3 hours in the land of the dead, he hopped off the slab, naked and defiant, and tried to find the nearest bathroom because he really had to pee. The staff ran. They didn't just walk away, they fled in pure, unadulterated terror. Because they weren't looking at a patient, they were looking at a ghost. They were looking at a man who had stared into the abyss, and when the abyss stared back, he simply blinked. This was the birth of a resurrection story that would define an entire era of Southern rap. Bushwick Bill wasn't just another wild figure in the industry. He was a one-man storm system, a living contradiction who defied logic, medicine, and the very limits of human survival. He was a man who could quote the darkest parts of the Book of Revelation in the same breath he used to threaten an enemy. He was chaos in a compact frame. But why? What drives a man to the edge of a morgue drawer? What kind of internal battlefield produces a human being so resilient that even a bullet to the brain feels like a minor inconvenience? To understand the resurrection, we have to understand the life that preceded the death. We have to go back before the Geto Boys, before the platinum records, and before the mind playing tricks on me-verse that still sends chills down the spines of fans decades later. We have to look at the man behind the myth, the 3'8" giant who performed like he was 10 feet tall, a man whose life was a series of crashes and resurrections, written in scars and recorded in blood. This is the story of Bushwick Bill, the man the world tried to bury, but who simply refused to stay dead. Bushwick Bill's story doesn't begin with a gold record or a high-speed chase in Houston. It begins in real, raw, life-or-death chaos. If you believe in omens, then the very moment Richard William Stephen Shaw entered this world on the 8th of December 1966 was a warning to the rest of humanity. He was a breech birth baby. In a small clinic in Kingston, Jamaica, Richard entered the world backwards, feet first, fighting every inch of the way. The doctors told his mother that neither of them was expected to survive the delivery. He was born into a struggle, a tiny warrior struggling for oxygen, defying the odds before he had even taken his first breath. He was born in the poverty-stricken streets of Trenchtown, a place where the sun is hot and the politics are even hotter. In the early 1970 seconds, Jamaica was a pressure cooker of political violence. Richard's family, seeking a future that didn't involve dodging bullets, escaped the island and fled to America. They settled in Brooklyn, specifically, the neighborhood of Bushwick. At the time, Bushwick was burning. It was a landscape of abandoned buildings, the early crack epidemic, and the sparks of a new cultural revolution called hip-hop. But for a child who stood only 3 feet tall, Brooklyn was a giant's playground where the giants weren't friendly. Richard was mocked. He was bullied. He was underestimated by everyone who looked down at him. They saw a dwarf. They didn't see the Popeye strength or the volcanic fire simmering beneath his skin. Richard didn't just survive the streets, he absorbed them. He became a master of movement, a breakdancer who could outspin anyone twice his size. He took the name of his neighborhood as his own. He became Bushwick Bill. But there is a side to Bill that the history books often gloss over in favor of his wilder antics. This kid, who grew up seeing dead bodies on the sidewalk and watching friends disappear into the void of addiction, found something unexpected in the middle of the carnage. He found faith. It started with a movie called The Cross and the Switchblade. Something in that story of redemption among the gangs of New York cracked him open. Suddenly, this angry street kid didn't want to be a gangster. He wanted to be a servant of God. While his peers were studying the streets, Bill was studying the Bible with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't just reading it, he was consuming it. By the time he hit his late teens, he left the concrete jungle of New York behind and traveled to a Bible college in Minnesota, and he didn't just attend, he excelled. He graduated at the top of his class, a licensed minister on track to become a missionary. Think about that for a second. The man who would later lead the horrorcore movement, rapping about the most twisted corners of the human mind, was originally preparing to travel to India to build schools and irrigation systems as a missionary. He had the scripture memorized, he had the passion, he had the calling, but destiny is a trickster. Before he could board a plane for India, Bill decided to make one final stop to visit his sister in Houston, Texas. He walked into the humid, bass-heavy air of the South and felt a vibration he had never felt in the church or the college. He saw cars shaking with low-end frequencies. He saw clubs thumping with a raw, unfiltered energy that felt more like a spiritual revival than a party. He walked into a club called the Rhinestone Wrangler, not as a rapper, but as a man who just loved to dance. He took to the floor, and for the first time, people didn't look down at his height, they looked up at his talent. A local DJ named Lonnie Mack saw the fire. A man named Jay Prince saw the potential. The missionary path didn't close. It just diverted into the neon lights of Rap-A-Lot Records. Richard Shaw was still a man of God, but he was about to become the wildest, most unpredictable prophet hip-hop had ever seen. He was stepping out of the pulpit and into the fire, carrying the Bible in one hand and a microphone in the other. The chaos of his birth had finally found its rhythm. When Richard Shaw arrived in Houston, he didn't have a plan to conquer the music industry. He was just a kid with a Bible in his luggage and a fire in his feet. But Houston, in the mid-'80s, was a different kind of animal. It was a frontier. While New York was preoccupied with the golden era and lyrical complexity, Houston was building something raw, something heavy, and something undeniably Southern. Bill started spending his nights at the Rhinestone Wrangler. He wasn't there to rap, he was there to move. He would hit the dance floor, and at 3'8", he was a gravity-defying blur of popping, locking, and breakdancing. He had the charisma of a giant. People didn't just watch him, they were mesmerized by him. He caught the eye of DJ Lonnie Mack and a young, ambitious visionary named Jay Prince, the founder of Rap-A-Lot Records. Jay Prince was looking for characters, for people who looked and sounded like nothing else on the market. In Bill, he found the ultimate wild card. At first, Bill was just a hype man. He was the little Billy who would jump on stage, dance, and get the crowd hyped for the original lineup of the Geto Boys. But that early lineup, Prince Johnny C. and Jukebox, wasn't clicking. The group was failing to break out of the local scene. Jay Prince realized he needed a re-engineering of the entire concept. He brought in a lyrical street general named Willie D. and a young, dark-minded storyteller from the South Side named Scarface. And then there was Bill. He wasn't supposed to be a rapper. He was just the dancer. But during the recording sessions for their breakout independent album, Grip It, on that other level, Bill decided he wanted to hear his own voice on the tape. Willie D wrote a song for him called Size Ain't Shit, a defiant, aggressive anthem that turned Bill's height from a punchline into a weapon. When Bill stepped into the booth, something happened that no one expected. He didn't just read the lyrics, he attacked them. His voice was high-pitched, unpredictable, and crackling with a manic energy. It sounded like a horror movie villain come to life, but with a street-smart Jamaican swagger that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a gimmick anymore. He was the third pillar. The chemistry between Willie D's power, Scarface's introspection, and Bushwick Bill's pure, unadulterated chaos created a sonic trinity that hip-hop had never seen before. Suddenly, the Geto Boys weren't just a Houston group. They were a national threat. Their lyrics were so graphic, so violent, and so unapologetically real that they became the primary targets of the parental advisory movement. Major labels like Geffen and Warner Brothers were terrified of them. They refused to distribute the records. The media called their music slasher rap. They were labeled as public enemies. But Bill thrived in the controversy. While politicians were calling for their music to be banned, Bill was in the press, quoting scripture and explaining that their music wasn't fantasy, it was a mirror. He told them, if it's on the news at 6 p.m., why can't it be on a record at 6:05? He understood that he was reflecting the trauma of the streets back at a world that wanted to look away. With the help of legendary producer Rick Rubin, the Geto Boys' sound was polished into a weapon. They were the first group from the South to force New York and L.A. to pay attention. They paved the way for Outkast, for UGK, for the entire Southern dynasty. And right at the center of that explosion was Bushwick Bill, the smallest man in the room, but the one whose shadow was beginning to cover the entire industry. The fame was coming, the money was flowing, but the missionary-turned-rapper was also descending into a personal darkness that even the bright lights of the stage couldn't illuminate. The pressure of being a character was starting to crack the man underneath, and a night of Everclear and PCP was about to turn his life into a literal crime scene. Every legend has a breaking point, and for Bushwick Bill, that point arrived on a humid June night in 1991. To the outside world, he was a rising star, a platinum-selling artist with the world at his feet. But inside, Richard Shaw was a man drowning in a cocktail of chemicals and unaddressed trauma. He was 24 years old, spiritually exhausted, and convinced that he was worth more dead than alive. He spent that day drifting through a haze that would have killed a normal man. He was consuming Everclear, Crown Royal, and gin, topped off with weed laced with PCP. His mind wasn't just playing tricks on him anymore, it was actively trying to destroy him. Bill was obsessed with the idea of a life insurance payout. He believed that if he died, his family would be taken care of. He had reached a level of despair where his own existence felt like a debt he could only pay back with his blood. He went to his girlfriend's apartment that night, not looking for love, but looking for an ending. He began to pick a fight, escalating the tension, trying to provoke her into a state of blind rage. He handed her a gun, a small caliber pistol, and he begged her. He didn't threaten her. He pleaded with her to pull the trigger. When she refused, the scene turned into a nightmare. In his drug-fueled mania, Bill grabbed her 2-year-old child and held him near an open window. He wasn't trying to hurt the boy. He was trying to force her hand. He wanted to give her a reason to shoot. The gun fired. A single flash of light, a deafening crack. The bullet entered through Bill's right eye, tearing through the socket and lodging in his head. He collapsed, the world turning black, before he even hit the floor. When the paramedics arrived, they saw the carnage and the lack of vital signs. He was pronounced dead on arrival. Time of death, approximately 4:35 a.m. This is the moment where the story shifts from a tragedy into a miracle. As we discussed earlier, Bill spent nearly 3 hours in that morgue drawer, tagged as a corpse. But the missionary inside him wasn't ready to meet his maker. When he woke up, he didn't just survive, he reclaimed his legend. But the industry is a cold, calculating machine. While Bill was still in the hospital, his eye socket a raw, bandaged wound and his mind still reeling from the shock, Prince and the Rap-A-Lot team arrived. They didn't just come to bring flowers, they came with a camera. They rolled Bill down the hallway on a gurney, his IV bag still attached, and they took the photo. That image became the cover of the album, We Can't Be Stopped. It is perhaps the most honest and most disturbing album cover in the history of music. It shows Bill, dazed and battered, flanked by Willie D and Scarface. Bill later admitted that he hated that photo. He felt exploited. He felt like his trauma had been turned into a marketing tool before he even had a chance to heal. He was a man who had just died and come back to life, and the first thing the world wanted from him was a pose. Despite the pain, Bill went into the studio weeks later and recorded his verse for Mind Playing Tricks on Me. It wasn't just a rap verse, it was a psychological autopsy. He talked about the paranoia, the thoughts of suicide, and the feeling of being hunted by demons. He turned his literal blindness in one eye into a metaphor for the way he saw the world. The Geto Boys reached the top of the charts. They were heroes to the streets and villains to the suburbs. But Bill was now carrying a physical and spiritual scar that would never go away. He had stared death in the face and won, but the night the world stopped had changed the frequency of his soul. He was a walking resurrection, but he was also a man who knew exactly what the inside of a body bag felt like, and that kind of knowledge, it changes a man forever. In the early 90s, the landscape of hip-hop was a fortress of hypermasculinity. It was an era defined by the invincible gangster, a monolith of stone who didn't cry, didn't bleed, and certainly didn't admit to being afraid. But in 1991, fresh from the morgue and still wearing the physical and spiritual scars of his resurrection, Bushwick Bill did something that changed the chemical makeup of the culture forever. He didn't just walk back into the studio, he walked back with a flashlight, pointed it directly at the darkest corners of his own mind, and invited the whole world to look. The result was Mind Playing Tricks on Me. On the surface, it was a chart-topping hit. But in reality, it was the first collective confession in the history of the streets. It was a 5-minute descent into the hell of post-traumatic stress disorder, long before the inner cities of America had the vocabulary to describe it. And at the heart of that masterpiece was Bushwick Bill's verse, a verse that remains, to this day, one of the most chilling and honest depictions of mental collapse ever recorded. Think about the imagery Bill conjures. It's Halloween night. He's standing on a corner, a 3'8" giant lost in a fog of paranoia. He describes a confrontation with a mysterious figure, a giant that he believes is trying to kill him. He describes the visceral feeling of punching the concrete, swinging at ghosts until his knuckles were raw and bleeding, only to realize that there was no one there but his own shadows. This wasn't tough guy rap. This was a man admitting that his greatest enemy wasn't a rival gang or the police. It was the chemical and psychological fallout of his own survival. By delivering that verse, Bill became a pioneer of vulnerability as strength. He was telling the young black men of America, men who were conditioned to bury their trauma under layers of bravado, that it was okay to be haunted. He was validating the hypervigilance, the insomnia, and the bone-deep anxiety that comes from growing up in an environment where death is a constant neighbor. He turned his missing eye into a powerful metaphor. He was seeing a world that was fractured, a reality that was distorted by the weight of what he had endured. But we must look at the tragic irony of this success. While the world celebrated the genius of the song, the industry began to treat Bill's mental health as a product rather than a crisis. They marketed his madness. They sold his eccentricity. Every time Bill appeared on a talk show or in a music video, the public expected the resurrection man, the wild, unpredictable dwarf who might do anything. The more he bled for the art, the more the world cheered. But the man underneath, Richard Shaw, was still wandering in that same fog of Halloween night. He found himself trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. He was now a global superstar, appearing on legendary albums like Dr. Dre's The Chronic and starring in hit films like Friday. He was the wild card of the industry. But fame is a poor bandage for a bullet wound to the soul. Behind the scenes, the struggle with addiction continued. The Everclear, the pills, the PCP, they were all attempts to silence the mind playing tricks. Yet, even in his darkest moments, the missionary inside him never fully disappeared. Bill became a quiet counselor to the streets. He would spend hours talking to fans about their own depression, quoting the same scriptures he had learned in Bible college to help them fight their demons. He was a walking contradiction. A man who rapped about assassins but spent his private time arguing theology and praying for the lost. Bushwick Bill had spent 52 years cheating death. He had survived a breech birth that should have killed him in the cradle. He had survived the crack-infested streets of Brooklyn, the violent internal politics of the music industry, a direct bullet to the brain, and the crushing weight of 1,000 chemical benders. He was a man who had lived more in half a century than most men do in 10 lifetimes. He was a living miracle, a walking legend, a man who felt invincible. But in early 2019, life handed him a diagnosis that no amount of bravado, no amount of fame, and no amount of willpower could ignore. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was terminal. The doctors didn't use soft words. They told him the end was not a matter of if, but a matter of when. For most people, a diagnosis like that is a signal to retreat. It's a call to find a quiet room, to gather the family, and to wait for the darkness to settle. But Bushwick Bill didn't know how to go quietly. He didn't know how to surrender. He had already spent nearly 3 hours in a metal morgue drawer decades earlier. Death wasn't a terrifying mystery to him. It was a neighbor he had already shaken hands with. He wasn't afraid of the crossing. He was angry, not at God, but at the machine. The moment the news of his illness broke, the industry did exactly what he feared. They tried to turn his tragedy into a marketing tool. Promoters and labels immediately proposed a Geto Boys farewell tour. They saw a final opportunity for a massive payout, a chance to sell tickets to a spectacle of a dying man on stage. But Bill saw right through the curtains. He felt that once again, the character of Bushwick Bill was being exploited while Richard Shaw, the human being, was being left to suffer. In a final, legendary act of rebellion that defined his entire spirit, he canceled the reunion. He told the industry he wasn't a circus act. He told them he wasn't going to be a puppet in his own funeral procession. Instead, he created his own path, a path that honored the missionary heart he had carried since his youth. He launched the Fuck Cancer Tour. He decided that if he was going to spend his final days under the hot lights of a stage, it would be on his own terms and for a higher purpose. He pledged 10% of every show's proceeds to help other cancer patients, people who didn't have the fame or the resources he had, people who were fighting the same monster in silence. The missionary spirit that had driven him to Bible college in Minnesota 40 years earlier had finally come full circle. He was no longer a rapper looking for a platinum plaque. He was a man looking for redemption through service. On stage, he was a ghost of his former self, physically weakened, his frame smaller than it had ever been, but spiritually he was more powerful than the world had ever seen him. He would sit in a chair, gasping for air between verses, but his voice carried a weight that made the walls tremble. He stopped playing the role of the horrorcore villain and started playing the role of the prophet. He quoted scripture between songs. He talked about life, about his regrets, about the children he was leaving behind, and about the peace he had finally found with the Creator. He was no longer playing tricks with his mind. He was speaking the absolute, unvarnished truth. But the disease was an aggressive predator. It moved through his body faster than the tour dates could be booked. The physical agony was immense, but Bill refused to hide it. He wanted the world to see the cost of the fight. He wanted them to see that even when the body is crumbling, the soul can remain defiant. On the 9th of June 2019, in a hospital in Colorado, the tornado finally ran out of wind. Richard Shaw passed away at the age of 52. The news hit the hip-hop world like a physical blow. From the veterans of the Houston Fifth Ward to the icons of the West Coast, everyone paused. They didn't just mourn a rapper. They mourned a miracle. Bill didn't die in a shootout. He didn't die of an overdose. He died as a man who had reclaimed his own ending. He had turned a terminal diagnosis into a final verse of defiance. He had spent his entire life being told he was too small, too crazy, or too broken to matter. But as he drew his last breath, the world was forced to admit the truth. Bushwick Bill was a giant. He had lived 1,000 lives, died 1,000 deaths, and in the end, he had shown us that even when the body is failing, the spirit can remain unstopped. He had walked into the fire one last time, and this time, he wasn't looking to survive, he was looking to be immortal. The story of Bushwick Bill is often reduced to a collection of wild anecdotes, the morgue, the eye, the madness. But if we only look at the spectacle, we miss the miracle. To truly understand Richard Shaw, we have to look past the 3'8" frame and realize that he was one of the most significant psychological architects in music history. He didn't just survive the world. He redesigned how we perceive human pain. Bushwick Bill's legacy is written in something far more durable than gold. It is written in the emotional DNA of every artist who has ever dared to be vulnerable. Before Bill, the gangster in hip-hop was a monolith of stone, unfeeling and unbreakable. Bill shattered that monolith. He was the first to show that the man holding the gun could also be the man shaking with anxiety. He gave the streets permission to have a psyche. He was the primary ancestor of the mental health movement in rap, a man who bled in public so that others wouldn't have to bleed as much in private. Think about the sheer courage it took to be him. In a culture that demands constant strength, he stood before millions and admitted to being haunted. He took his physical differences, his height, his missing eye, his scars, and he didn't hide them. He weaponized them. He proved that the height of a man is measured from his soul up to the heavens, not from the floor to his head. The boy who was born feet first in Kingston, fighting for his first breath, died as a man who had mastered the art of the final breath. He didn't build schools in India as he once planned, but he built an academy of truth for the marginalized. He taught us that the monster is often just a human being trying to survive a nightmare. On the 9th of June 2019, the body of Richard Shaw finally rested. But Bushwick Bill didn't go back into a morgue drawer. He became part of the atmosphere. He is the bass that rattles the windows in Houston and the courage in the heart of every kid who feels like they don't fit in. He cheated obscurity by being too real to forget, and he cheated death by living 10 lives in the span of one. Rest in power, Richard Shaw. The world tried to bury you, but they didn't realize you were a seed, and the harvest you left behind will feed the culture for 100 years to come. The heart stops, the lungs fail, but the rhythm is eternal. Stay safe, stay aware, and never let the mind play tricks you aren't brave enough to face.